Start now.
All right. Hey, folks. Today I'll be discussing our recent work done in collaboration with Thomas Thebaud, Sonal Joshi, Martin Sustek, and others here at CLSP on the topic of poisoning attacks and defenses for speech recognition. Let's start with a brief background on adversarial attacks against neural networks. On top, we see the OG adversarial attack scenario. Originating from the image domain, it was discovered that for each image, such as the picture of a kitten that we see here, with its corresponding correct label, in this case, cat, it is actually possible to find adversarial images that will induce the model to produce the incorrect label of the attacker's choosing, while not deviating excessively from the original image as measured by some kind of norm difference.
Sorry,
please.
I just wanted to say this example, I think both predictions are
Of course. That's very confusing. Yeah, I agree. So the perturbation would often be so small that it will be imperceptible to the human eye. Similar phenomena have been observed in for models in other domains. For example, in audio, given the original audio,
turn off the lights.
One can additively apply the adversarial perturbation and result in the model misinterpreting the command.
Turn off the lights.
I guess if you play the first and the third audio side by side, you can hear a difference, but if you just heard the third one, you may not be able to tell that something is going on. In many cases, adversarial samples can be found with gradient-based methods, such as projected gradient descent, or PGD. One limitation to the original adversarial attack threat model is that oftentimes access to the trained model is necessary. In addition to that, adversarial attacks often involve digital manipulations, severely limiting the scenarios in which you can apply those attacks. As such, a new attack paradigm has gained interest in the community with the research on adversarial attacks in neural networks, known as poisoning attacks. In this setup, the adversary is given access to a portion of your training data. In addition to that, they also have access to the model architecture and the recipe that is used to do training. The adversary is not, however, given access to the actual model. The adversary is also often expected to be limited to natural sounding triggers. In the audio domain, that would involve stuff like clapping, car horns, basically things that can be applied at recording time without digitally manipulating the audio. One of the earliest concrete incarnations of poisoning attacks is shown here. It's called the dirty label attack. The idea is very simple. Say you want the model to incorrectly identify a cat as a dog when a trigger is being applied. Then, at training time, find a subset of cat images and apply the trigger to the input. At the same time, you flip the training label from cat to dog. This way, during training, the model will learn to associate the presence of the trigger with a prediction of a dog without paying attention to the rest of the image, which would have suggested otherwise. The idea of an adversary having access to your training data sounds absurd, right? You're probably waiting to ask me this question. Well, to that I say, first of all, let me take a mental note to, once I finish this talk, log on to the CLSP grid, find your data, and flip a few labels. On a more serious note, it has been shown in the community, especially by folks with systems security backgrounds, that poisoning attacks are actually a realistic concern. As more and more of our data are web crawled or hosted partially or fully on the internet, it often doesn't cost the adversary much in terms of money or effort to replace a small yet significant portion of our data. This revelation calls upon us to examine the strength of poisoning attacks, as well as possible defenses against them. So, are we doomed? Well, maybe not. A simple yet potentially unrealistic defense is known as human in a loop. Basically, take a look at your training data before you start training. it is always a good piece of advice, whether or not someone is out there flipping labels in your data for fun. A single mislabeled data point may not arouse your suspicion. But what about when you start seeing a pattern? A more feasible alternative to human in the loop is to take advantage of self-supervised learning, removing the ill effects of flipped labels automatically. The idea is reasonably simple, as illustrated by the diagram on the right. We basically learn unsupervised representations of the data. Then we cluster those learned representations. We take advantage of the assumption that each class is reasonably homogeneous in our learned representations. And then we subsequently identify out-of-place samples that are clustered with other members that are labeled differently. We identify those as poison examples and exclude them from training. The effectiveness of our DINO-based cluster and filter defense is shown on the top left graph. So these ones are DINO-based results. The ones on the left are baselines, which have been comprehensively outperformed by our methods. On the bottom left, we have a graph that shows the benign performance of the systems after the defenses have been applied. From there, we can see that unfortunately, sometimes strong filtering defenses come at the cost of sacrificing a couple of points of benign performance. In order to get around the aforementioned weaknesses of dirty label poisoning attacks, a new type of poisoning attacks, clean label poisoning attacks, have been put forward. Clean label attacks involve the following process. First, the adversary picks a bunch of samples from the target class, the green class. Then they use some traditional adversarial attack technique to push it from the target class to the source class. Finally, the trigger is applied to the adversarially perturbed input. Since the label is unchanged and the adversarial perturbation is often imperceptible to a human being, a human would not be able to identify the sample as poisoned, hence the name clean label attack. However, from the model's perspective, this has a similar effect as poisoning a subset of their source class with a trigger and then flipping their labels. In our effort to further improve the performance of clean label poisoning attacks, especially in certain difficult scenarios, such as low trigger strength or low poisoning percentage, we propose the ranked selection clean label poisoning. For the intuition of this improvement, we appeal to the same diagram that we showed earlier. We note that instead of picking arbitrary green points from the target class, we instead pick the likes of class 1 and 2, points 1 and 2, those that are already on the edge of the green class. This has the effect of making the model learn a more cleanly separated distribution of classes, making it more likely for the trigger to work. This is supported by the graph on the left, which is a graph that plots the log likelihood difference between the source and target class in our data set. About 1% of them are just like naturally very negative, meaning they are already very likely to be misclassified. So it supports our preliminary understanding of the distribution of training samples. We proceed to test ranked selection on the fluent speech command task, comparing ranked selection poisoning to both our baseline, the orange line, the random selection poisoning, and the blue line, which is what we call reverse rank poisoning. What happened there is that we're picking the target class samples that are least likely to be misclassified and performing clean label attacks on them. Something that we first did by accident. The graph shown on the left demonstrates a clear trend towards greater attack success rate as we pick samples that are most likely to be misclassified. Moreover, the graph on the right, which involves an attack with only 1% attack percentage, demonstrates a case where the only attack that works is the ranked poisoning setup. That combined with the fact that about 1% of the target samples are naturally going to be misclassified seems to support our initial hypothesis. Okay, this is still a work in progress with additional experiments and analysis planned for the coming weeks. If you have any thoughts, suggestions, or questions, you're very welcome to reach out to me. Thank you so much for your time.
Questions, please. Question? You have showed a variety of types of attacks and probably like things to do. I understand. What is just out of curiosity? What is the part in which you are focused? Because you said like you're working with other people.
Yeah.
And you have presented like an overview of like what I understand all of you guys are doing. What is your focus and what is your future? How do you see what you are going to do in the future? So
the filter-based defenses was a team effort. Thomas is the guy who's leading it. Right now, I'm mostly working on, so I guess the summary, or what I've done so far is I applied clean label attacks, which is not a new idea, to speech. I made a few small incremental improvements that made it work just a little better. I guess there are two immediate things that I think of doing. First is, well, applying even more incremental improvements, especially those that are targeted towards the speech domain. That is something I haven't really done so far. The other one is basically to apply currently existing defenses to them, see how effective they are. Because a lot of defenses are modality specific. We don't actually know if they will actually work, including our own actually. So like we're going to apply DINO or filtering defenses to clean label attacks. We don't think they'll work, but it's worth figuring out whether they actually will. And then beyond that, I think in general, there's this very interesting dynamic in the adversarial machine learning community, which is that it can sometimes feel a bit like a cat and mouse game in the sense that someone comes up with an attack, someone else comes in with a defense, and then once the defense is known to the world, someone else can obviously find a way to get around that defense. It's something that people try to break out of by ideas such as coming up with theoretical guarantees for robustness, for example. But those, unfortunately, I don't think are particularly practical in the context of the stuff that we put into production. So yeah, that might be a little nebulous. I don't actually know for sure how to get around them, but that's an observation.
So we have, oh yeah.
Is there a way that you can defense clean label attack, or there's a development literature on that?
Well, they're like system-based defenses. For example, you can hash, you can associate, you can store a hash for each training label or like training sample, and then you just compare the hash to the actual sample during training and see if it's been corrupted. Yeah, there are these like kind of simple ones. I cannot off the top of my head tell you any nicer. Yeah. In general, learning-based methods are not particularly good because as long as you have a gradient-based thing, it can be attacked.
Yeah.
That's generally speaking true as far as I know. Yeah. Yeah.
So how aggressive can clean that?
What do you mean by aggressive?
So I mean, you cannot notice, right? I mean, both ways. So how can you detect? I mean, how can I how to modify the signal or how to I don't even know how to explain. So what I'm thinking is since we have the target and also the source, right?
Yeah.
And you're trying to get that clean so nobody will notice it, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
So what kind of techniques or are you gonna use to make it like that, right? So that it is, so I'm not sure if I'm representing this correctly, so, but I'm thinking is that nobody will notice this, so what is in between these two?
Oh, I
Please
guess,
provide a 30-second answer. We
Okay.
don't have more time. We're already over the time.
well, yeah, I guess projecting from clean to, honestly, clean label attacks are not imperceptible either, right? The trigger is perceptible. You can see the Amogus thing on there, right?
Oh.
So, yeah. I think the idea is to make it even less perceptible than this.
Right.
I don't know if that's actually how the people are planning to do things, but we'll see. I'll let you know when it updates.
Thank you.